Okay, this is on. Fantastic. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here in person, and as well for people online. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Justin Reich. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Director of what's known as the National Churchill Leadership Center here at George Washington University. And this is the first event of the center for the 2023-2024 academic year. And again, thank you for attending. The topic of this event, understanding how China's government challenges America, may have receded from the focus of the international community due to the tragedy that's ongoing in Israel and Gaza. However, although the spotlight might not be on the topic right now, I'm certain that it will return. I know Professor Sutter thinks that as well. There are many statistics one could employ to discuss and refer to the relationship between the United States and China. And allow me to just employ three of those right now. China has 19 major shipyards, and America has 6. And just one of China's major shipyards has more capacity than all of the American yards combined. Now, that was a statistic taken with the permission of Dr. Jerry Hendricks, who gave the Stephen and Jane Poss Distinguished Churchill Lecture at the 2023 International Churchill Conference, which was held a few weeks ago in Edinburgh. So I'm going to let that statistic hang and not really discuss it, and maybe get into it after Professor Sutter gives his remarks. But allow me now to introduce my guest. Professor Robert Sutter is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. He also served as the director of the school's main undergraduate program involving over 2,000 students from 2013 to 2019. And he earlier served a full-time position as visiting professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. He is a PhD graduate in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University, and he has published 22 books, which is 22 more than me, Professor Sutter. Over 300 articles and several hundred government reports dealing with the contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relations with the United States. His government career saw service as senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific, at the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council, and the China Division Director at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sutter, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it very much, and welcome everybody to our presentation today. What I'd like to do, you have my talking points with you, and so you know what I'm going to say, and you can read that at your leisure as you do beforehand or afterward and review it and so forth. And so I'm just going to try to talk a little bit more informally about it. We're a small group here, and so we can do that easily. And then for you at home, you in your home situation, I think you'll be able to follow us quite well. My concern is to explain why this enormous change in U.S. policy toward China. All in this room remember that we had this strong engagement with China, very cooperative in all sorts of ways for over 40 years. Why did it change? This is what I'm trying to explain to people. And it's very hard to explain it. It's a very dramatic change. It's become very serious. We talk about tensions. People talk about war between the United States and China over Taiwan. So the question is, why did this change come about? And the reason from the American perspective is that they came to see what China was actually doing as opposed to what it was saying. And by China, I mean the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party state. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about Chinese people. I'm talking about China as a government. And what you find is that after a while, Americans see the Chinese actions as very challenging and very unfair and nefarious and sneaky and underhanded and so forth. And so we need to understand this a little better, to understand the challenges and why the Americans have reacted the way they have. Now, this emerged erratically. It emerged 6 years ago with the Trump administration. And this is not Mr. Trump, but the Trump administration adopting a strategy which saw China as the number one danger for American national security. Now, this had never happened before, where China was seen as the number one danger to American national security. The Soviet Union was always number one, and China was an ancillary to that in the Cold War. And so in this situation, this is quite dramatic. And this was announced in December of 1979, 1 year into the Trump administration. Mr. Trump didn't pay any attention to his strategy. He hardly ever spoke about it. I don't think he ever spoke about it, and he never spoke like it, except for one occasion. I watch his remarks all the time. I only saw one occasion where he did this. But his people, the people that worked for him, in the security apparatus in particular, domestic security and in defense, they did see this. They did agree. And in economics, the special trade representative, he too saw the danger posed by China. And they felt that something had to be done about this. And so they carried out things. And Mr. Trump began this as well in his so-called trade war. You're probably familiar with that, the Donald Trump's trade war beginning in 2018. And so that was part of it. But the attention to the public, the attention of the country to this issue was they looked at the trade war, but they didn't see China as a danger this way. And so the media didn't cover this. Public opinion ignored it, basically. And who did pay attention? The Congress. Bipartisan majorities in the Congress looked at this in 2018, and they said, yes, this issue is a fundamental challenge to the United States, and we have to counter it. And it's multifaceted. And so how do you do this? So it emerged in this period. So this is why it was important. So this foreign policy change occurred in Washington. I've lived in Washington for over 50 years, and people in Washington say policy is always made here, you see, and that's usually wrong. But in this case, it's correct. And it was the Congress working with these people in the Trump administration that moved the policy along. Now, it emerged erratically. 2019 was a very positive period by comparison. We had trade negotiations and then a trade agreement, and very positively received by the administration. But then things changed badly with COVID. And with COVID coming in March of 2020, Mr. Trump's campaign for the presidency was totally disrupted. And he switched to a very strong position against China, source of COVID, this kind of argument, very tough. And public opinion then started to switch against China. And Mr. Biden, the Democratic candidate, had to switch against China in response to this sort of thing. And so by the end of 2020, the Americans were in a very negative mode in dealing with China on the basis of a whole series of differences that we had with China. And this continued under the Biden administration. Mr. Biden, I mentioned that Mr. Trump was very irregular, unpredictable in dealing with China. Mr. Biden was very soft on China in 2019. Like most Democratic candidates, they ignored China as a danger. And Mr. Biden would be asked in interviews, well, what do you think about China? He said, I'm not worried about China. We're much more powerful than China. Why should I worry about China? And so he acted like that. And that's very different than the Congress. The Congress said this is a very serious challenge to the United States. And so you find in 2021, when Biden comes in, somehow he changes his mind. I still haven't figured that one out, but he definitely changes. His people change. Mr. Jake Sullivan in 2019, maybe some of you know who he is, the National Security Advisor of the United States. At that time in 2019, prominent supporter of Biden in the campaign, he said, if the people of America aren't concerned about China, and in 2019 they weren't, then why should we be concerned about China in the campaign? So very different. And so they changed. And why did they change? I think Congress had something to do with this, but I'm not sure. But there was a big change in his approach. And now he's adopted a very systematic approach in dealing with China, not erratic like Mr. Trump. And it's much more effective. And we've gone through the first phase of this competition with China, acute competition with China. And I think I'd have to say the Biden people have been very successful with a very strong support from bipartisan majorities in Congress. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail and talk about what are the challenges. Now, the thing about the Congress, though, a couple of points about that. Usually when the Congress gets involved in foreign policy, and I worked for Congress for 24 years, so this is based on my experience as well as other things. The Congress gets involved because partisan issues are at play. So they do it for partisan reasons. They do it because public opinion is moving in a certain direction. They react to that. They do it because of special interests, and they react to that. And they do it because they want to take power away from the president, or the president is trying to take power away from them. Those four reasons are often what gets Congress involved in foreign policy. They are not important in this case. And what's important in this case is the issue itself, the dangers posed by China. And these congressional members, Democrats and Republicans, put aside partisanship for the most part, put aside these other issues, and they say, this is dangerous. And they're working to do what? Fundamentally, they're working to defend America. That's what they're trying to do. So we need to understand the perceived dangers of these people, which I think are actually real dangers. What are they? That's the thrust of my paper today, my discussion today. There are 100 of these dangers, at least 100 that I can count. I mean, we've just this year, we have spy balloons, we have TikTok, we have intrusions, we have, you just name it. And we have these kinds of manifestations of these challenges. And so you have to put them together in clusters. And I have them in three clusters. One is the security cluster. And so let's just take a look at what's at stake there. For over 3 decades of rapid development of Chinese modern military power, they are tipping the balance in the Indo-Pacific, supporting China's territorial expansion and undermining U.S. alliances and partnership in seeking dominance in Asia. The American strategic presence in the Asia-Pacific region has been based since World War II on preventing the region falling under the control of a power hostile to the United States. If that were to happen, that power would pose a direct threat to the United States comparable to the threat the U.S. faced from Imperial Japan dominance in Asia and Nazi Germany's dominance in Europe in the dark days at the start of World War II. That calculation is fundamental, and that's why they see a big challenge here, the strategic challenge. The economic challenge from China, that's the second big cluster. It's a whole range of things. But second is the challenge posed by China's similarly long-standing efforts using state-directed development policies to plunder foreign intellectual property rights and using massive intervention by wide-ranging and well-financed apparatus of the Chinese Party state structure to undermine international competitors, having increasingly profound negative impacts on U.S. and Western interest in the prevailing economic order. Beijing does so with hidden and overt state-directed economic coercion, egregious government subsidies, import protection, and export promotion using highly protected and state-supported products to weaken and often destroy foreign competition in key industries. In this way, it recently seeks dominance in major world high technology industries and related military power to displace the United States and secure China's primacy in Asia and world leadership. That's a mouthful. Take a look at it, but it's fundamental. The third one is in governance. And here, China's challenge to global governance is more than any other power. Beijing leverages economic dependence, influence operations, including pervasive corruption and elite capture, and control of important infrastructure to compel deference to its preferences. In the Indo-Pacific region, these practices are backed by intimidating Chinese military power. Beijing's preferences include legitimating the above predatory Chinese economic practices and territorial expansionism, opposition to efforts promoting accountable governance, human rights and democracy, opposition to U.S. alliances seen impeding China's rise, and support of the forceful foreign advances of Vladimir Putin's Russia and the rule of other authoritarian and often corrupt world leaders unaccountable to their citizens. So these are the clusters that take place here. Ladies and gentlemen, why do American policymakers get excited about this? Because there are two that are really existential dangers. And the two are, the first is the security one. If China dominates Asia, it will be a direct threat to the United States. And that's widely held. And the second one is economic. If they dominate these high-tech industries are an area where the United States has been a prominent leader. They will take that away from the United States. The United States will be second to them, will be an economic loss of tremendous consequences for the United States. Yes, but the militaries of the world depend on high technology. If China has the higher technology, they will have the better military, the superior military, and they will dominate the United States. In a nutshell, if you want to know why people in Congress that look at this issue get so concerned, they don't say it this way. I'm synthesizing this. They don't want to be dominated by China. So please keep that in mind. And that's been the case for 6 years. And they've acted on this very urgently. And so they say, we've got to defend America. And that's what actions they're taking to do this. Now, as I've already covered my ground here, I'd like to, if I have a minute or two, I'd like to just talk about how are we doing in competition with China. And here I can report we've had our first phase, and the Biden administration's approach is good. It's effective. It works without causing war, without shooting anybody. This is a good policy in that respect. What are they doing? They're doing three things. Number one, they're strengthening America at home to compete with China in the high technology areas, to have the capacities that we need in order to deal with the Chinese challenges in international governance, economics, and so forth. And they've done this with the spending up to now almost over $1.5 trillion on large legislation. The infrastructure bill, in that bill, that was American infrastructure. We have to fix our infrastructure. And Mr. Biden argued about this, and this showed where he had come into line with the congressional views. When he had to lobby for this in early 2021. And he came out and he spoke in this way. He said, this is a very important bill for the United States. We don't want China to get ahead of us in this regard because, and he put it this way, we can't let them win. This is old vacillating Joe Biden saying this. Pretty direct stuff. Okay, then we have, so that bill, then we have the two other bills came, and you may remember the controversy about the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Lots of controversy about that. And the US was supposed to be distracted from this and change its policy. What did they do? They right after that, they passed two major bills, over $1.5 trillion worth of spending, dealing with computer chip technology advances and science advances to compete with China, and dealing with the climate change legislation, which is full of provisions targeting China. So those two bills passed right after the Pelosi visit. And they were followed by restrictions on high-tech exchanges with China that would advance China's computer chip technology to stop that. And those things are underway. And now we're restricting our investment in China. And we already restricted Chinese investment in the United States. And so what we're doing is cutting off China from access to various important aspects of American society and American economy. We're a very porous country. And an apparatus like China, this is a party state, folks. An apparatus like China has all these different elements hidden in many cases that go about the business of establishing control in various areas. And it's it's very, very scary in lots of ways. And so you have to watch it very carefully. And the Congress in 2018 passed a bill which captures the theme. We need a whole of government effort to counter these challenges coming from China. And so we've got that. The first element is this domestic building, which the Biden people promised. The second is to go head to head with the Chinese in their actions in dealing with international affairs that we feel are unjust and so forth, like the crackdown in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, and this type of thing, going directly with them, and on governance issues, going directly to face, and calling them out on these types of things. And then the third thing, let's take a minute to talk about this, is building positions of strength that will allow the United States to deal with China from an overall position of strength. And what is the strength that the US has? It has all this internal strength, but it has allies and partners. And Mr. Biden is clearly a big believer in allies and partners. And he's brought allies and partners together in a way that's really amazing. He's been lucky to some degree, but it's quite striking. And what has happened as a result of that? They've built these positions of strength. Just let me review a few things in 2023. If you look at the map of Asia, in the north, you find, in northeast of China, you find Korea and Japan. And they have been at odds in various instances, South Korea and Japan. And they're both allies of the United States. And now Mr. Biden and his administration has managed to bring these countries together in a node of power. The three powers have had this summit at Camp David just 2 months ago, an enormous step forward. And for China, this is a very adverse development. And then in Japan, they have changed their military policy, and they've become very active on dealing with Taiwan and preparing themselves to fight if necessary, if the Taiwan contingency emerges. Further to the south, you find the United States has worked very effectively with Japan and with Australia to win over the Philippines. And the Philippines is now standing against China. It's expansionism in the South China Sea. And the US is backing them up. This was not the case at all before. And then further south, you have AUKUS. AUKUS is the British, the Australians, and the United States. And they have a broad arrangement to deal with China in a whole range of areas, military and economics and so forth. Meanwhile, we had the Russian attack on Ukraine. And that was supposed to divert attention away from China. It didn't happen. And what did happen is that the countries of Europe came to link what was happening to them with Russia, with China, the main international backer of Russia, in cahoots with Putin. And so they said, my God, Asia really means a lot to us. We can't allow China to take over Taiwan by force. And therefore, we need to work with the United States more closely. And so they become deeply involved with Asia. NATO has shifted completely on this issue. They're very active in dealing with security issues in Asia, with East Asia. And so China is viewed very negatively from the point of view of European leaders and from the point of view of these alignments they have. The G7 very much moving in this direction as well. So these are all positions of strength that the Biden government has built over the past year that are problems for China. And China doesn't have a good answer for it. So looking out, what do you see? You see China very committed to its approach. They're not changing. Xi Jinping has spent the leader of China has spent 10 years to get to the position he's in now. And he has an agenda. He's pursuing that agenda. And that agenda is all these offensive things that they do. That's going to continue until they change. And I'm not sure when that will happen. But the US is very determined on its side, because it's not just the administration, it's the Congress, the bipartisan majorities of the Congress. They say yes. If anything, they say, give us more. We need more defense. So this dynamic, therefore, is going to lead to tension. This is George Washington University. I've been teaching at this place part-time. I started here in the 1990s. George Washington University is a liberal school. They want to fix things. They don't want to fight. So this is a very unpopular thing. When I say this to my students, they all wince every time I do it. They just say, oh gosh, he's doing it again. You see, but I have to do it. I'm an evidence-based analyst. I've been watching this for years, and I have to let you know what's happening so you understand. Is this what I think is great? No. I had to change my mind. I looked at the evidence just like those people in Congress. They didn't think. They were engagers of China. Why did they change? They said, look at what they're doing. Look at what they're doing. And so the result here is that you're going to have tension. The US is cutting off these things that the Chinese had easily had access to. They don't like that at all. So there's going to be tension. Okay, calm down. We've dealt with tension before. The Soviet Union had 30,000 nuclear warheads aimed at us. And we had 30,000 nuclear warheads aimed at them every day for decades. When you, as an intelligence officer, when you went to work, you said, okay, don't make a mistake. You don't want to make a mistake. We lived with it. We can do it. It's not that hard. We're not at all at that stage yet. Maybe it'll ease up. But if it doesn't, it's certainly not the end of the world. We can do okay. And the Biden people seem to understand that. And what they're trying to do is say, okay, we're going to compete with you. We're going to cut you off. And we're going to do things you hate. But at the same time, we don't want conflict, and you don't want one either. So let's set up arrangements so we can have dialogues and avoid conflict, avoid military conflict, and proceed. Because we're going to have a struggle. And so that's what we're in the midst of. And I think our framework is sort of laid out. I think it's not a bad one. I think we've had some success. And I'm anxious to see what the next stage is going to be. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Well, that was very important. And I wrote down an incredible amount of questions, which I certainly will not be able to get to all of them. And I want to say, so we're about half past the hour right now. In about 15 minutes, we're going to open up the floor to questions from attendees, both online and in person. And we'll have staff at the center running a microphone. But Professor, if I could ask you to go back to the 70s and talk about when you were very young, and talk about the change in which China's relationship with the United States, what was it then? And what were the factors driving that relationship? And just take us back to a different time.
Yeah, well, that's the wonderful thing. That's the wonderful thing that for me, I started my career watching the opening. It was really remarkable to see. And the change was very dramatic on the Chinese side. You all are probably vaguely familiar with North Korea. You understand how that works. It's China. China was very much like that in 1967, except it was chaotic. It was more chaotic. The Cultural Revolution was extremely disruptive. Basically destroyed their foreign policy. And they alienated just themselves from just about every country in the world. And so they were extremely isolated and involved in a power struggle that eventually removed the hierarchy of and by removed it, sometimes it was very ugly. Violent. of the party and the government. There are three organs of control in China: party, the government, and the military. The government and the party were totally disrupted at the senior levels. And the military was then brought in to keep some order in China. And the cities of China in 1968 were basically under martial law. The Red Guards had ransacked the place, and then they started fighting with one another. And so there were 18 million Red Guards. And so the military was called in and clean out these people and send them to the countryside where they languished for over a decade or longer. So that was all carried out. In that process, there was a lot of resistance, and over 1 million people were killed in that relocation. And so when I first looking at China, we had overhead photography, satellite photography, so I could look down at the cities. The cities of China, so many of them had these large swaths of area that had been burnt to the ground. And I said, what the heck is that? Well, obviously they were fighting, and the firefighters couldn't come in and do all the fighting, so they just burned. So this is China, that's right. Undergoing tremendous and very divided regions, fundamentally divided. And so the point is that why did they shift to be more pragmatic in dealing with foreign affairs? They were totally radical. Well, they had. And what happened was the Soviet Union changed from a blustery Khrushchev who didn't back up what he claimed to do, to a Brezhnev who always backed up what he claimed to do with tanks. And so Brezhnev took over in 1964. The Chinese were making an issue of the border with the Soviet Union. They already had made issues on foreign policy issues, but now they were making issues of the border. And so Brezhnev wanted to reaffirm that the border was the way it was and wasn't going to change. And he built up his forces all along the border with tank divisions. And so he placed them in the same way that the Russian forces were placed when they came into China at the last month or two of the Second World War and neutralized the Japanese. They were just deployed like that. Plus, they had 6th Division in Mongolia. These are motorized divisions. They're designed to move fast on flat terrain. And that was really flat, relatively flat terrain from there to Beijing. Close. Anyway, that's China's position. And the upshot of this, the Chinese didn't perceive this as danger because they really were focused internally until the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, August of 1968. And the Russians deposed the regime there, imposed another one with tanks, and they announced this: we reserve the right to do the same thing to any deviant communist country. This was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, you know the old story about the Snow White, the witch. I figured, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? You know, this is mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the most deviant of them all? Obviously, China is the most deviant. And so some in China got very nervous because they looked at their situation. They were totally outgunned in the border. The military was occupying the cities. They weren't ready to fight anybody. And so they became alarmed, and they reached out to the United States in the middle of this turmoil caused by the Vietnam War, the assassination of Martin Luther King. 1968 was a horrific day, a horrific year for the United States. Worst, until COVID, that was the worst year I had ever experienced in the city. And the city burned. It burned for days. The firefighters couldn't go in. The snipers would hit them. And so 14th Street, U Street burned. The military came in. They had armed combat forces were in the city, forcing a curfew, keeping order in the city. So that was the situation in the United States, and the anti-war demonstrations, 2,000 at a time, would come about and so forth. So Nixon needed a way out of this issue. So the convergence of him needing a way out and worried about the Soviet dominance in arms, in military arms, and of course the Chinese obvious fear of being dominated by the Soviet Union, drove them together. I have a minute, just a side point. There was a professor here at GW in 1969 when the Soviets were really warning. This came out in September 1969. He was a very prominent Sino-Soviet expert, and he was taken out to lunch, and the attaché told him, he said, "We're going to have to invade China and destroy their nuclear weapons. What will your country do? Will you join us?" And you say, "Wow, what an outrageous idea." Do you know who Robert Kennedy is? Right? Anybody know Robert Kennedy? The brother of John Kennedy. He was the Attorney General in the Kennedy administration. In 1962, he approached the Soviet embassy. People, and I think he did it. I'm not forgetting who did. Approached the Soviet embassy and said, "We're very concerned about Chinese people. We're not sure what to do. You join us?" So it wasn't so far-fetched. You see what I mean? But that's what China was up to.
So, no, thank you. You talked a lot about in your remarks the problems that the United States have internally has in terms of addressing what you, I think, fairly described as growing tension. But what internal problems does the Chinese Communist Party have that would cause them to falter in this tension?
To falter in their continued expansionism? Well, they have liabilities. They have lots of dangers. The economic system is facing enormous challenges and will probably slow down and stagnate to some degree. And we just don't know when it's slowing down now. How bad this will be, how long this will go about, can they change it? The plans they have, most economists don't think those plans are going to work. They have a demographic decline of enormous consequence. In other words, where they have the birth rate is very low, the working class, working level people are increasingly diminishing, and the retirees are growing like crazy. Because in the Maoist period, he encouraged people to have a lot of children. They did. So from 1949 until 1979, it was common to have 4 kids, 5 kids in a Chinese family. So all these people are now, the baby boomers. They're all getting very old and retiring. And since 1979, you've had a one-child policy that was enforced. And now they've tried to reverse it. It's not enforced anymore, but it's become common. That's what people do. So the result is they have one child. They have one child the parents, when they retire, and then grandparents, if they're still living, they rely on just this one kid. So this is a tremendous problem that they have because they don't have an adequate social security system. So that's another dimension. They have governance issues of various sorts. They really didn't do a very good job in managing the COVID issue in the end. In the beginning, it was outstanding. Their system was well geared for doing that kind of isolation and testing. That was outstanding. And we were losing 100,000 people a month, and they were losing very few. But boy, it didn't work here for a while. And last year, we had demonstrations of large numbers. The first we've seen under the leadership of this very strongman leader, Xi Jinping. He's been in power for 10 years now. This is the worst demonstration he's had to do. So that's another line that have to work.
If we could, and this is always wrong, but if we could predict or at least attempt to potentially understand the ramifications of a change American presidential administration next year. I thought you did a really wonderful job of detailing the ways in which the Biden administration has attempted to bring in allies, et cetera. But if there was a return of President Trump or just another president, what pitfalls do you see in the American approach to this growing tension that could happen? Potentially, is there some crazy summit that President Trump posts like he did with Kim Jong-un? But what are the realistic obstacles that you foresee?
This is the main danger to this approach that we have. This is the main. This would really complicate the situation. Feel like an America first president. and they stuck to the American first attitude, because that attitude doesn't respect allies. It sees allies as moochers, and therefore we should cut off the support of allies. Mr. Trump is certainly in the lead in that regard. And that would undermine this whole that whole third element that I talked about of building strong points around China in international affairs that assist the United States, not just in a security sense, but also in working together on economic issues, working together on high technology issues. These are very important countries in all these different capacities. And so you want them on your side, and you don't want to alienate. And Biden has done a good job of that, and Trump would muck it up. He certainly mucked it up badly during his administration. His people had a very good idea, had a good strategy, but they couldn't follow. It got fouled up repeatedly. So that would be very challenging. Now that's the bad news. The good news, or I take reassurance in, is that Congress has been now doing this for 6 years. And these members, as I tried to underline, most of them have done this on the basis of the merits of the issue, the way they think about the issue. Now, I'm not sure I mentioned this, but having worked with Congress, what did I find? I found that members of Congress, dealing with foreign affairs, the members of Congress don't deal with foreign affairs all the time. It's usually very secondary. And so when they have to take the time to figure out what to do about an issue, and their staff work together and they come up with an agenda, usually the members say, okay, I agree with that. That's what I agree with. And they remember that. And they don't change their minds. So unlike people like me and looking at foreign affairs, you constantly adjust. You're constantly looking at new evidence and trying to figure out things. They don't do that. They're too busy. They're running for re-election. They got to vote on all these other stuff. It's secondary. And so they stay. And so what's going to happen? Well, these cohorts have now been doing this for 6 years. And so I think they're going to continue to do this. And who are these people? These are people in safe states or safe districts. They're going to keep getting reelected, and they're not going to change their mind. Which means what? Which means they're going to be a very stabilizing force in sustaining this defend America attitude against China. And so if Trump or DeSantis, if somebody comes in with an America First agenda, they're going to say, thank you, that's nice, and they're going to try to undermine it. And they're going to try to steer it in different directions to make sure it doesn't disrupt the important elements that they see that have been created to deal with defending America against China. Because it's very much job one. This is very important for the United States. If you see what I mean, you don't get this right, you're going to be dominated by China. That logic just continues to drive so much of this moment.
And my last question, and we'll open up to the floor very quickly, Professor. Recently, China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, reopening embassies in their countries. I mean, from somebody who has a relatively naive understanding of that area, why China? What purpose did it serve? And was it opportunistic? And I was very surprised.
China has done an excellent job in improving relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same time. And we're in a very unusual phase in the Middle East. I don't know that much about the Middle East either. But I do know that Iran and Saudi Arabia used to hate each other a lot. And they had tremendous differences between each other. So it seemed insurmountable. And now they're not. Now we have a more fluid situation. They want to work together. And so they've been working together to improve relations. And they're at a stage where they want to have some sort of reconciliation. And China has good relations with them. So it's a logical choice. So it shows China's influence in both of these countries, which is very strong. And it shows that China is in a position to do this. Of course, certainly the United States wouldn't do this. And I'm not sure Russia could do this. Maybe it could now. But the point is that China was an obvious choice in that sense. And it brought them the opportunity, because they wanted Xi Jinping is looking for ways to show the profile of China. As I indicated in my talk, in 2001 and particularly 2002, with the invasion of Ukraine, China's relations with very important countries, mostly the developed countries, really took a hit, a big hit, because they were supporting Putin. These people were outraged at Putin, what Putin did. And so the result was that China doubled down on improving its relationship with what they call the global south. And these are two most important countries in the global south. And so the Chinese doubled down, improving relations with them. So it's a logical thing that they would want to advance this and keep this momentum going to show that they are doing okay in the international.
Thank you. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And okay, so I'll start with you right here. And then Alex, you can go next. Start.
Hello. In your points, you mentioned first the military challenge, technology challenge, governance challenge. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, it really seems like the governance challenge is kind of the main variable that's changed. That military, the China's been building up its military even before Xi Jinping came to power, and China has been continuing its trying to do IP and technology that before Xi Jinping came to power. What would you say is the main influence of Xi Jinping on these considerations that Congress is making? And if a leader that is less aggressive in power, would these change any of these assumptions?
Right. Very good question. I think it's a matter of degree. Xi Jinping clearly was more expansionist on the military dimension. On the economic dimension, clearly much more aggressive and moving into and just more capable. And what you find is that China's strength just grew. So everything they did was magnified because of the strength. And he used that very effectively. And then on the governance side, these are the various things, the many things that they do in governance as they seek influence. When China interacts with a country, they seek elites. They want progress right away. So they're not interested in winning over the people. That takes too long. So they influence elites. And they find them and try to employ them or somehow otherwise control them, influence them in various ways, so that they have their way in dealing with the issue today is in China. And so this kind of practice is much more prominent with Xi Jinping. And they seem to be getting more funds. They seem to be much more robust than they were. This is the United Front Work Department of the party, and there are various other components that do this sort of thing. So I think it's really heavily a matter of degree, and you're enhancing the power of an already very powerful place. So on the economic side, this is the Made in China 2025 initiative. Was under Xi. This is designed to make the Chinese more self-reliant in a lot of ways, but it's made the Chinese able to dominate the key industries of the future. And when they do this, what happens? It's an industrial policy on steroids. Because the entity you're dealing with is armed companies. You're dealing with the party state mobilizing the people of China to support this kind of endeavor. So it's a very powerful force, if you see what I mean. And so what do they do? Well, I mean, in the past, they wiped out steel elsewhere. And then they wiped out, the solar panels. They wiped that out. And then by 4G, and they pretty much wiped that out. And now they're, I think electric cars, they're going to wipe that out pretty soon. And they do this with the Huawei company is the poster child of this endeavor. It's private, certainly it's supposed to be private, but it gets all these support from the government. It's part of a competitive group of national champions inside China that's developed totally protected. And then they advance, and they are highly subsidized, and they become powerful, and one or two of them then goes overseas, again with highly subsidized. So they undercut the prices of the competition. And they dominate the field. So if you like that economic model, but they can do it. They can do it. And other countries can't. We can't. How can we do that? That's so even with industrial policy. So that's what they've done. And it's that kind of enhanced greater power having tremendous impact as a result of that.
Sir Prater, how's the gentleman?
Professor, and you had mentioned Chinese moved to the 1960s. How did the conflict in the Amur River between Russia and China affect their attitudes toward each other and towards the United States as a possible international partner?
That was a turning point. Just for your information, everyone, there was the Soviet forces were on the border, and the Chinese contested it. They said, and they began contesting the border in 1963. They said this is it, and then when they got angry with the Soviets, which they did often, the Soviet Union was probably they got worse treatment than the United States in China. When they contested the border, they said this is an unequal treaty that where the Soviet Union, Russia took all this territory from us, Tsarist Russia, and we implicitly saying we want it back. So this border was widely disputed, and so the patrols then patrolled on the borders. We didn't know much about this, how this was happening, but in March 2nd, 1968, 69, and March 2nd, 1969, they had a border clash on a disputed island in the Amur River, which runs on the in you remember Manchuria in the north of Korea, and there's an Amur River runs there, and the tributary anyway was on this river, and this and so the Chinese attacked Soviet company that was patrolling, and they killed some. You know, I don't know how many, but they killed some, and then they announced it to the world, and they had this big statement, you know, maybe 20 sheets of stuff that they said, and the Soviets did the same thing, giving their side of the story. Now this is Brezhnev. He did this to Brezhnev. What did Brezhnev do? 2 weeks later, a whole company of Chinese were white, maybe 100, and that began the publicized armed conflict on the border. It wasn't known up until that point. And the Chinese at this point were in a phase of very sharp criticism of the United States. That opening that they tried to make in 1968 to Nixon coming into office in late 1968, that failed. And in its place was a very strident approach. And that approach showed in this instance when they said, Nixon, you colluded with Brezhnev to do this. So that's how they felt about Nixon. So what did this reflect? An enormous power struggle in the Chinese people over this issue. Which part of the administration was going to win in this? And who were the players? On one side was a person called Zhou Enlai. He was the premier, the civilian leader, and well respected in the world. But he did Mao's work. On the other side were radicals like the Gang of Four, they called them. But in this case, the real actor here was the defense minister, Lin Biao, and his entourage. And they seemed to want the tougher line. Now, outsiders looking at this is the classic, how do you determine what's happening in China? You read tea leaves. I mean, you might as well, because you didn't have much good information. So that's how you did it. But we watched this develop, and we found that this struggle was not really resolved until this. Henry Kissinger arrives in China on a secret mission in July of 1971. And who's he met with? He's met by protocol officers from the new foreign ministry. But you know who else is there? One of the top 8 military leaders of China, of the Communist Party of China. Who later became president of China. His name is Ye Qingming. Ye Qingming met him at the plane and took him to see Mao. And they negotiated, and he left. All this was in secret. And then it was announced that Nixon was going to go to China. That was in July. In September 1971, in September, it's announced that Lin Biao was dead. He was trying to escape China after launching a coup against Mao. Plane crashed in Mongolia, and his wife and his son were on the plane. The high command of the military was immediately arrested. They did not appear again for years until the Gang of Four was purged, and then the Gang of Four went on trial, and then these military leaders. So this dynamic is where this was that leadership dynamic. This is life and death struggle they were going. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so anyway, thank you for helping me recall a very dramatic phase in this.
Thank you. Karen, I know you had a question.
Thank you for your remarks about the late sixties. I spent them at Harvard as an undergraduate, and I agree with you, that was nothing compares to that period. But I took a course as a junior or senior, one Graham Allison. And he convinced us that we came very, very close to losing everything as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a fascinating tabletop exercise. But he's still with us, and you know, he's read the book on the coming war with China, and I wondered what your views of his point of view or theory about, you know, what happens when you have a rising country or civilization and a declining civilization and use of English travel, all of that.
Okay, well, I'm an evidence-based analyst. I worked at the Central Intelligence Agency for 9 years. I worked as an analyst in the Congressional Research Service for 24 years, and then I worked in the National Intelligence Council and the State Department at various times. And intelligence officers, if they're any good, they rely on the evidence. They don't get swayed by theories. Of course, the practitioners don't want that. They want to know, what do you mean? You know, I remember sitting down with the senator, briefing him about Asia when he was taking over the Asia subcommittee in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. John Glenn, and he was senator from Ohio. Very, good guy, very solid, and he wanted to know everything. And I went on about something, and he said, "How do you know about this?" And I said, "Well," and it was interpreting what people were saying. And he threw the briefing book at me. He can say, they can say whatever the hell they want. You see, so in other words, you got to have proof. And you better have some evidence, otherwise you're going to get creamed. And so you can do these theories, and I've just watched this carefully, and I've been participating, and this danger of war is exaggerated. I mean, war is a disaster. And I think it's widely recognized in China that's a disaster. And so do they want to fight the United States? I don't think so at all. And I have pieces of evidence I can give you that show this. It's not going to convince you. But look at Trump and what he said about China, all the nasty things he did about China. He's very insulting to all sorts of people. And he was very insulting to the Chinese, and they have face. They worry about his face. And he just insulted them repeatedly. And who was the guy in charge of managing Trump in China? His name is Xi Jinping. And he managed Trump. And did he ever punish Trump? Did he ever do a negative thing about Trump? Did he ever say anything negative about Trump? Did China ever do that? And you'd say, and then you have to say, why? They do it to all sorts of other leaders. Why don't they do it to the United States? I don't think they want to get into a war with the United States. I think that's the main reason. And so that persists. That's been the case for some time. And the reasons are obvious. I can go through them, but they're obvious. And so until that changes, until they show they're ready to hit us. They're ready to do that. And you watch, they're not. It's all very incremental. It's all and a lot of posturing, but they don't cross the line at all. So, but they might. I mean, someday they might. So I'm waiting for that. But I don't. The theory isn't going to convince me that this is going to happen.
Professor, One last question. I saw there was a gentleman right in front.
I'm Alex from the GM, the concrete study. So my major question is, do you think the behavior that current Chinese government is doing is because Xi Jinping itself, or you think it's the governmental systemically their project, or they have a plan for that? And if so, do you think if change the leaders, the next leader will continue to inherit it with Xi Jinping's policy, or they maybe have a different idea?
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's a very good question. I think it's a matter of degree and how much you push. The issues that the Xi Jinping is pushing have been around for a long time. And so, and Chinese officials have felt negatively about the United States for a long time. 1995, I had an opportunity to have an elite trip to China for several days, talked with senior leaders. I met with the senior intelligence officer in the PLA and had roundtables. And at the roundtable, they were beating me up pretty hard because I worked for Congress and they wanted me to know how negative the attitude was toward Congress in China at that time. This is 1995. And in that, one guy stood up. He said, "You got fed up. He said, you Americans, you want to continue to dominate, you want to remain a leading power in the world. You want to be the leading power in the Asia Pacific region. You want to continue support for Taiwan. And you want to change our political system." And he said, so there were 7 of them who wanted me. And I knew this stuff from an American perspective. And I said, that's and he looked at me and he said, he saw that and said, "You're dreaming if you will accept that. We will wait you out." And so I've been waiting. And now we have Xi. And now he's acting on it. These are the differences with China. These are the fundamental. They're still there. So will this go away? I don't think so. If you see what I mean, it's a matter of degree. Will they calm down? Will they? Sure, we know what you want, but we're going to make sure you don't get it. But we know what you want, and can we get along in that type of vein? I don't know. We'll have to see. Right now, I can't predict because it's just I can predict more struggle, and it depends on how that struggle works out. Seems to me. What the outcome of the struggle.
Professor, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure you would be happy to answer further questions after the event. Thank you all for joining us. And our next event is next Thursday, when we'll have General Petraeus and Andrew Roberts here talking about their new book. Please join me in thanking Professor Sutter.